Hey now! What is up, everybody? My name is Mike Brown, aka Review King MB, and I am here for Smallville Rewind. This episode is titled Hug. And after rewatching this episode, a lot of things came back as far as my memory goes, me remembering this episode and saying, oh, okay, yeah, this seems familiar. But I can't help but wonder, why the hell is it called Hug? Like, going off of the Freak of the Week, his ability, it should be called Handshake. And I know that sounds, super nitpicky, but it's the title of the episode. Every other episode has been on point with why it was called what it was called. Even Hothead, it's like, I get it, but Hug? This character doesn't hug one person on this show anyways. The beginning of the episode, we see Bob Richmond. He is the Freak of the Week. He's this business looking guy, suit wearing guy, goes into this guy's office, and he has this reputation of somehow being able to talk people into selling something that they wouldn't normally want to sell. As they talk more and more, he goes to shake his hand, Bob does, and when this guy shakes his hand, immediately eyes go green. You kind of get what's going on here. So upon skin touch, which is why it's called Hug, but again, he's not hugging anybody, he's shaking their hand, he can command them to sort of do whatever he wants. This ability in some ways reminds me of Kilgrave. If anybody saw Jessica Jones season 1, what a great show, what a great season. And what a great villain Kilgrave was. Obviously, this isn't as gnarly and as hardcore as what that character ends up doing. But it's definitely a similar vibe. And so Bob talks this guy into committing suicide, jumping out of his window. There's actually a pretty cool effect when Bob goes down the elevator. He's about to walk outside. You see the body of the person he was just talking to fall onto this cab. It was practical. There is something about practical that, however many years, it still looks great. Bob wants to come to Smallville, something about Smallville meaning something to him. We jump to our main characters, Clark, Lana, and Chloe. All three of them are riding horses, which I find interesting because, well, the first thing I think of, I know Lana has been riding horses. She's established that she has her own farm, or her aunt does, and she rides horses all the time. But seeing Clark in particular ride a horse, it made me think about Christopher Reeve and how that's how he was paralyzed, is falling off of a horse. I don't know if that's why they did this, the writers. It just was a reason for these three characters to be, I guess, hanging out and being in this trail in the middle of the woods where they were. They start talking about this guy, Kyle, who's sort of known as the myth in Smallville as this guy that lives in the woods. He's a loner. He's weird. As Clark and Chloe go ahead on their own, they hear Lana scream. Clark has to, and it's funny because Chloe is having such difficulty on this horse, and Clark says, here, hold on to my horse, and she's like, oh my god, what? And Clark conveniently has to look over, see that she's not paying attention, super speeds away, although I think she hears it and she turns back and she doesn't see him. And they focused on her face. It made me wonder, like, was she thinking something? Was she wondering, how did he do that so fast? Clark has to be careful with how quick he is to use his powers. So Clark sees that the guy that they were talking about, Kyle, is sort of like hovering over Lana. Looks super creepy, I'm not going to lie. And Clark yells at him to get out of there. He runs, and Clark checks on Lana. You come to find out Lana has a concussion, so that she got hurt bad. But conveniently, there was a camera. I think it was Chloe's camera, because Chloe mentioned she dropped her camera back. And so Clark and his parents check the camera. They see the footage that Kyle actually didn't do anything to Lana. He didn't hurt her. He didn't cause her to fall. He actually was checking on her. So Clark thinks, oh shit, okay, well maybe we got this Kyle guy all wrong. And Clark goes to talk to him, and it seems weird, right? Kyle's like aware that he's the weirdo. He lives in the trailer on his own, and he knows things about Clark, knows things about the town and whatnot. There's a scene where Clark goes to our coffee shop, sees Lana there. Lana's there with Whitney, in fact, and Whitney is getting less and less screen time as the episodes are going along, and he's becoming far more one-dimensional as these episodes are going along because, I mean, look, granted, I said before, I understand the idea of Whitney being a little annoyed of Clark, given that it's obvious that Clark likes his girlfriend. Sure, but Lana actually went through something where she could have been seriously hurt and Clark was there to sort of look after her. Whitney was nowhere to be found. And when Clark is checking on her and talks to her and told her about his conversation with Kyle and how he seems like a decent dude, Whitney's just being a dick. Like a flat out obvious dick, to the point where he says, if I was there, this wouldn't have happened to her. And, dude, okay. I get being annoyed of Clark, but you weren't there. Clark was there. Your girlfriend was not killed or attacked or something worse. So give Clark a little leeway. It's not like Clark was in front of him hitting on her. Like, give Clark an attitude when he actually warrants it or deserves it. That was completely uncalled for, Whitney. It really was. Kyle happens to be in the same area. Clark runs into him. He sort of strikes up a conversation of, what are you doing here? And Whitney sees this, and Whitney loses his shit. Now this, maybe I'll give Whitney some leeway, because to Whitney, yes, he's not going to think good of this Kyle guy. He's not going to trust him. On sight, he's going to see him and say, F this dude. So, okay, fine. Whitney goes up to Kyle and says, hey, if you go near Lana again, it's going to go down. And it gets ugly. Clark offers to take Kyle home. And Bob happens to be around. Of course, Bob, late at night, lurking around in, like, the town square. He sees this, he approaches Whitney, he shakes Whitney's hand, turning Whitney's eyes green, and Bob, what do you think Bob has Whitney do? So we cut to Clark dropping Kyle off, and Whitney shows up and tries to attack him with a bat, and they struggle for a bit. Clark, as he was leaving, sees Whitney's car, so he knows something's going up. He goes back. All Clark sees is Kyle now taking the bat away from Whitney and going to swing at him. And I love the effect of Clark zooming in front, super speeding in front of Whitney, absorbing the hit from the bat. The bat shatters. It's always a cool effect. They did this like 2 or 3 times beforehand, where Clark has to absorb something that gets shattered in front of him. Now, I thought Kyle saw this, and so I said, oh shit, Kyle's going to see that Clark is superpowered. Clark even does a force push and pushes Kyle far away into his trailer. So I thought, okay, well, there's no doubt that Kyle knows that Clark is super powered, right? Whitney almost wakes out of this trance, this hypnosis that Bob put him under. And I was wondering, like, okay, how is Whitney going to react to this? Is he going to say he doesn't know what happened, doesn't remember anything? Or no, when the cops show up and the cops actually arrest this Kyle guy, Whitney claims that, oh, I just showed up here to talk to him and Kyle attacked me. And I thought, well, wait a minute. Is Whitney just flat out lying? Like, because that's obviously not what happened, but I'm trying to give him the benefit of the doubt that he was hypnotized, and so maybe he doesn't exactly mean this. Does he think that's what happened? And so he's just saying that? Obviously, Clark doesn't buy it. He thinks that there's more to the story. Whitney gets offended that Clark doesn't take his side and actually thinks that Kyle might be innocent. And then we cut to the scene where the next day where Clark is home, Lana shows up and she's talking to him, and Lana is pissed. And look, when I first saw this, I'm not going to lie, I had the biggest crush on Lana Lang, or maybe Kristen Kruick. I don't know. I was a teenager. I was at the right age where I was all about Lana Lang being the love interest. I wanted Clark to get with her, right? So I don't remember feeling this way at the time. But rewatching it now, I hear Lana say that, how dare you accuse Whitney of attacking Kyle. You think Whitney would do something like this? Whitney wouldn't hurt a fly. Okay, she didn't say that exactly, but she was acting. She was coming across with that type of energy. And even Clark says, oh yeah, well, Whitney strung me up in a field and could have had me killed if he was just left there. And Lana makes this face and goes, oh, that's what this is about? You haven't forgiven Whitney for what he did to you on the field? Why would Clark forgive Whitney? That's ridiculous. That's the craziest thing Lana has said to date. Lana says something along the lines of, you know, Clark, if you don't like Whitney, then just say so. You can't tell that Clark doesn't like Whitney? There was literally just a scene in this episode where Clark was trying to talk to you, Lana, you specifically. And Whitney was there being such a effing dick to Clark. Barely would let Clark talk because he kept throwing out some annoying one-liners. Oh, if I was there, blah, blah, blah. And this isn't the first time Whitney has done this. Whitney has done this with Clark numerous times. Lana can't pretend like there's not tension between them. Lana can't pretend that Clark wouldn't like Whitney. How does she not know this? And she walks off, and Clark had this look on his face like, what the fuck just happened here? And I honestly had the same reaction as Clark did. Now, Bob arrives at the farm to try to persuade Jonathan to sell his farm. Now, I don't know why it's specifically their farm. I mean, I get it. It's the main characters, the main cast. You have to put them in jeopardy. But Bob in general, it's like all of the places he could go, all of the areas he could take. It's the Kent's farm specifically. And I love the fact that when he tries to shake Jonathan's hand, Jonathan's wearing gloves. So obviously, and it told us it has to be skin-to-skin contact. Just shaking his hands through the gloves ain't gonna cut it. And Bob even has this face of like, ah, shit. That didn't work. And they're going back and forth. Jonathan's not interested, obviously, in selling the farm. Bob, pretty smooth move, honestly, of pretending to fall, trip, and sprain his ankle. He says, hey, Jonathan, can you lend me a hand? When he sees that Jonathan has already taken his gloves off. So, oh no, Jonathan takes his hand, and you see the effect. It's a pretty cool effect, especially for this time period of we go inside Jonathan's eyes. We see exactly what's happening with Bob's powers going into Jonathan's head and his brain, and we see his eyes turn green. And Bob gets Jonathan to sign this goddamn contract to sell the farm. I love how we immediately cut to Martha yelling at Jonathan of, how could you sell the farm? And Jonathan doesn't even like argue back, doesn't defend himself. He just sits there and goes, I don't know how I could have done this. Like, how did he convince me to sign this? This is ridiculous. And Clark goes to the coffee shop again. Lex is there. And Clark is trying to get advice from Lex. I like that Lex has become a guy that Clark can go to for advice, given that Lex is so much older than Clark. Let's not talk about that. So he's talking to him about not just the farm being sold, but also Lana, all of that situation. And Lex makes this random reference, calling him Atticus, referencing To Kill a Mockingbird. And granted, maybe Lex just read this book, so it's on his mind, but Lex always makes weird references or always references things that are even beyond my comprehension. Never mind a 16-year-old, however old Clark is supposed to be. You know, it's like, of course Clark doesn't know what he's talking about. It's almost a reminder of how much older Lex is, and also the two different backgrounds that the two characters have. And there's this funny scene where, because of their conversation, Clark realizes that, oh, I need to go see Kyle in jail. So, but he doesn't say that. He just gets up, and Lex says, where are you going? And Clark says, I'm going to jail. Why didn't you say I'm going to see Kyle in jail? He just says, I'm going to jail. And so Clark goes, and we actually find out in the scene that Kyle also has the same ability that Bob has, where he can touch your hand and get you to do what he wants. He gets the guard to let him out of the jail. Clark sees him walking out of the jail dressed as a cop or whatever. During this time, Bob has gotten to the deputy. So the deputy shows up and tries to shoot Kyle, which is wild. And Clark super speeds to try to save him. And I like that at this point, Clark doesn't realize that he's bulletproof. This has happened a couple times where Clark is more reliant on trying to dodge the bullets because Clark doesn't know what's going to happen to him. So he just runs up and he doesn't hit the bullet, right? He just tries to grab Kyle, move him out of the way. One of the bullets, though, hits Kyle in like the shoulder. So Clark takes Kyle to Lex's mansion. Kind of wild that he would bring him to Lex. Even Lex says, "What makes you think I would be so willing to harbor a fugitive?" And Clark says something very interesting. He says, "Well, you're the only person I can trust, Lex." Really solidifying how far these two have come as friends. Like, this is what Lex has wanted for the longest time. It almost felt like it was one-sided. But this is, I'm not going to say the very first time, but Clark really showed that he relies on Lex big time. Lana goes back to Clark in his barn. And I was wondering, like, because they did not have a good conversation, so she's back. What is she going to say? She heard that Kylo broke out of jail. And the way how she phrases this of like, so I heard that Kyle broke out of jail. I wanted to see if maybe you changed your mind. Almost like, well, so now that Kyle has exposed that he's a bad guy, do you have something to say to me, Clark? Like, that's just the vibe and the attitude that Lana had. And I was like, what the fuck? Lana, what are you doing? Why are you pissing me off in this episode, Lana? Her coming here with that attitude was pretty wild. I love that Clark was like, if you think I'm going to apologize, think again, lady. And Lana gets upset. Now, look, trying to be objective, trying to understand Lana's point of view. This time around, if Lana does hear that Kyle broke out of jail, it does make Kyle look bad. She's right. So I can understand. She says she wants to preserve their friendship. So she just wanted Clark to maybe take her side or be on her side. I'm trying here, right? But Clark obviously says there's more to the story, and so you can't be judging Kyle like this. And so I like the scene where Lex is talking to Clark and Chloe. Chloe at this point doesn't really know what's going on. Lex says in front of Chloe, let's go pay Kyle a visit. Like, and Lex gives Chloe a look of like, I'm trusting her with this information that I have Kyle at my place because she's your friend. So I'm going to trust her. It was a subtle thing. It was a quick moment, but I appreciated that. Also, because this was right after a scene where Bob tries to talk to Lex, tries to shake his hand, and Lex is not having it. Lex is like, I don't like you. And we also find out that Lex's lawyers are helping the Kents deal with this little contract situation. So when they get back to the mansion, you find out that Kyle has left. Whoever they had watching over him, she was clearly mind wiped or whatever by Kyle, so that he left. Chloe and Clark go to the trailer and they see Kyle trying to pack his stuff to leave. And Chloe wants to know for sure. She wants to be sold on the idea that Kyle actually has these powers. So she tells Kyle to prove it. And I was surprised by Chloe's spunk here of like, come on, prove it. Use your powers on me, basically. And so I was like, oh no, I don't, this is where is this going to go? Kyle shakes Chloe's hand and has her kiss Clark. And she just is all about it. She touches Clark's chest, makes out with him hard. Clark has this look on his face where he is so uncomfortable and awkward. She wakes up out of it and doesn't have a memory of it. That confirms that people don't have a memory of whatever they have them do. And I love that, like, she's like, all right, so are we going to do this or what? And Clark's like, let's just say it happened. And she figures out, oh, shit. And I almost wish they dealt more with that. The fact that Chloe has had the hots on Clark this whole time and she got to kiss him, but she doesn't remember it. And she's also embarrassed because Clark remembers this. We get this great scene of Bob going to Lex's mansion. One of the few times where Lex says to a visitor, an impromptu visitor, where he says to Bob, how did you get through my guards? And Bob says, oh, he was very persuasive. So obviously we know how he got in. Doesn't explain how everybody else barges in to the mansion. And they talk back and forth. Bob says he's going to drop the lawsuit. He's just going to leave. So because you won, Lex, let's put it there. And they did a great job of, they just held on Lex's face, went to commercial, blacked out, and then we didn't see what happened. We didn't see if he shook his hand. Great cliffhanger. Jump ahead to Clark trying to get Kyle to confess and expose Bob to the cops. And Clark calls Lex. And you could tell, even, you don't see Lex, you just hear his voice on the other phone. You could tell something's up and something's different. Just the way Lex sounds, right? You're like, okay, he got to him. And when they're in Lex's car, Lex just gets out of the car, starts dousing it with gasoline. I love how Clark's like, Lex, what's going on? He's covering it with gasoline, and Clark just doesn't know what's going on. Lex, is everything okay? And Lex just sets the car on fire. Clark has to grab Kyle, zoom out of there. Lex sees this. He sees Clark use his powers, and Lex goes, ooh, Clark, I knew you were keeping something away from me. Bob shows up, gives Lex a gun. So Lex is stalking Kyle and Clark in this like garage with a gun. He threatens to shoot Kyle. Clark reveals himself, and Lex, they have a brief exchange where Clark's trying to say, hey, we're friends, don't do this. And Lex is like, we're not really friends. I see how your parents look at me. I see how this whole town looks at me. And yes, Lex is under the Bob influence, but how much of that way of thinking is like subconscious, deep down, real thoughts of Lex? Lex just starts shooting Clark. Boom, 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 boom. And they have the effect of Clark trying to dodge the bullets, Matrix style, but there's too many bullets. Eventually, he starts getting hit. He gets hit a lot, like 5-6 times at least. Falls down, and I'm sitting here going like, he looks like he was affected by it. Like, why didn't he just stand there and eat it, right? And Lex goes over to him. You see that the bullets didn't affect him. Clark throws Lex like across the room. Kyle goes outside, runs into Bob. He uses his powers on Bob, which is interesting because it's like, was Bob trying to use his powers too? Were their powers counteracting each other? And Kyle gets Bob to shoot himself with the gun, and Bob dies. Clark gets out there, and Kyle reveals that, hey, Clark, I saw you get shot. I know you have powers. And I thought to myself, all right, Clark's going to have to kill this guy. Like, what other explanation is there? But Kyle says, you know, he's not going to tell a secret. He just wants Clark to make sure he uses his powers to help people. He inspired him to do the same. And Lex doesn't remember anything. So you have to remember that. Cut to a scene where Lana goes back to the Kent's house to talk to Clark again. And I'm like, oh no, what's going to happen here? And Lana just kind of, I don't know if she didn't apologize, and she kind of made it seem like maybe she was just going to forgive him. It almost felt like, well, we had our conflict, but it's the end of the episode. We can't stay mad at each other, so we're just going to drop this. Because I don't really get like why she comes over and just forgives him, or just says whatever. She says that like our friendship's too important to let this argument destroy it. And hey, that's mature, right? That's actually makes sense. But given their age, they're high school kids, I just don't buy that she's just going to... In her head, Clark took the side of a potential killer or somebody that attacked her. And she's just going to forget about that? Like, yeah, okay, sure, fine. I'm back to liking Lana again. Fine, sure, whatever. And we get a cool scene of Clark in his barn. Lex arrives, still says, hey, I don't remember anything. So we're going to acknowledge and confirm that Lex doesn't have knowledge of Clark's superpowers. But Clark has an interesting question of saying, hey, Bob and Kyle used to be partners, used to be friends. Because it was a whole story of how they got their powers from the meteor shower, because they were salespeople together, blah, 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 right? Who cares? But they used to be friends, and they became enemies. And Clark says, do you think anything like that would happen to us? Which is like, it's a weird thing to ask your friend. Hey, do you think we'll ever end up hating each other? But Lex has an even weirder reaction of like, you know, Clark, our friendship's going to be the stuff of legend. Which is like, nobody talks like that. Nobody would talk like that. But because it's Clark and Lex, that sentence is perfect. Like, it's the greatest sentence ever. So I enjoyed this episode. Sure, it was silly. Sure, it was goofy. Sure, the freak of the week. It was just whatever, right? And yes, Lana annoyed me a bit throughout this, but I'll always be a sucker for these Clark and Chloe moments, the Lex, just Rosenbaum in general. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think of Hug, aka should be called Handshake? Did you like it as well? Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. Later!